For example, prestige pricing, charm pricing, um, other types of psychological pricing, for example. And then if anyone has, and I'm sure everyone on this call has purchased an airline ticket, you may very well be aware of this idea of dynamic pricing, where the prices change depending on how the demand has shifted since the tickets or the seats became available. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the details later on this call, obviously. Thank you. Let's zoom out from this actually a little bit. Brian, what's the goal when it comes to pricing strategy? What's really our goal? What's our end goal? Is it really just as simple as maximizing dollar value, or is there more to it?
I mean, I guess I can answer that a couple different ways. Yes, I can say the goal of pricing is to maximize top line and bottom line long-term, lifetime value of the entity. I mean, in short, I would say pricing ultimately comes down to a financial decision. I would say now you have to decide how much do you care about revenue versus profit? How much do you care about customer adoption versus margin maximization? How much do you care about getting the few most valuable customers to you and kind of getting the most kind of worthwhile deal with them versus appealing more to the masses, but maybe potentially leaving something off the table, right? And so forth. And how much do you want to invest in pricing versus all the other things you could think about doing? Because every minute you're thinking about R&D, you're not thinking about pricing, and every time you're thinking about pricing, you're not thinking about operations, et cetera, et cetera. And we won't even talk about fundraising, which I'm sure none of you guys ever think about. So if I unpack that a little bit, I would say for most companies that are small to mid-size very small to small, let's just say, which is pretty much everybody here. I would generally say setting yourself up for long-term profitability is important, but getting customer adoption and getting revenue and so forth and continued customer traction is really going to be critical for you in terms of getting credibility, in terms of getting investor support, and getting all the things that are going to be doing. And so showing a long-term business model you want to think about, but thinking about a pricing strategy that's going to be relevant and help you to drive adoption into your core target segment. And so thinking about a customer segment, which isn't two customers because that's probably too small, but not necessarily it's going to be, $756 billion marketplace, because then you're probably defining your addressable market as way too large for what's really achievable. Thinking about that core customer segment that you're really focused on, where you have the right proposition and it's your primary focus, and then getting that right balance of value creation for them and value capture. So I would say the goal is exactly that. And if you do that well, that's going to lead towards long-term revenue and profit maximization for the company.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd call that optimizing rather than just maximizing. And we'll talk a little bit more later, of course, about how we get into that. Um, just kind of going back to you, Edward, maybe you or Brian, if you could talk about the importance of setting your pricing strategy correctly, and obviously beyond just kind of getting the right price point. Joe, if you could go to the next slide. I know you have a slide that you kind of wanted to talk about and how that affects other parts of your business. So if you could speak to that briefly.
Uh, yes, sure. So I again, this is something that is fairly well understood, but from a marketing perspective, pricing is the only revenue generating element of the marketing mix, and it drives profit. It helps to shape perceptions of a company or a product or service in the market, and it also drives or influences demand in the market. And I think if you put this particular slide actually in PowerPoint presentation mode, you can see that there, well, actually, it doesn't really matter. The sales price, or let's say the achieved sales price, if you make a variation of that, 1%, so if you increase the sales price by 1%, or let's think of this in terms of the actual net price, the price that is achieved, that is actually invoiced. If that price increases by 1%, that results in a corresponding increase. And I can't actually see what is the percentage there, Iolette, on my screen.
11,
11%,
11.1. Yeah.
an
So far more
11%.
than anything else. Yes.
Exactly,
Hmm.
an 11% increase or decrease. If you were to decrease your invoice price by 1%, then that would correspond to an 11% decrease in profit. So it is the strongest profit driver, and therefore it's very important. But as I said, it is also it shapes perceptions in the market, and it influences demand generation. So it is very important.
And obviously this is one of the most important things. And before we kind of switch gears into really talking about the details, let's talk a little bit about timing. And I'll turn it to any of you that wants to answer this. When should companies start thinking about pricing strategy? Who wants to take this?
I can take a stab at it. I think, pricing in general and pricing strategy as part of that is something that can be a very powerful tool in just even the earliest days of like ideation, company formation. I would say one of the most valuable things to do when you're doing early customer discovery is to be talking about pricing. And I think it's uncomfortable and common as a result for people to avoid that part and to focus the conversation around, would you use this? Would this be useful for you? And sort of ending it there instead of testing hypotheses around pricing itself. Would you be willing to pay a subscription for this? Would you be willing to pay a royalty for this? Would you be willing to pay on a per reagent basis? And would you pay this much? And I think there are many examples of when a customer or a potential customer exploration conversation would sound amazing. Oh, we've really figured out an opportunity in the market. And then once you start talking about pricing, they start to drift away and seem a lot less interested. And that is the opportunity to find out, what would you need to see to be willing to pay this much or with this framework. And knowing with the BTI cohort, it's a lot of early stage companies. I would be really, really focused on that early on, because I think it's common for folks to get started with like MTAs or sort of trade data for access. But even in that setting, start putting numbers, even if it's paid after the proof is found. If you're saying, I think my product will be able to someday show this value to you, and I would like you to pay me this amount once I do that, see when they push back. So I think, from maybe that's not pricing strategy, but just rather pricing in general is really important to include at the very beginning of customer discovery.
All right. Anyone wants to add to that before we switch gears?
I would like to add one thing, if it's okay, Iolette. And
Yeah.
so I totally agree with what was just said. Uh, I would also encourage people to think about products and services over the whole life cycle of those products and services. And this means that even if you are thinking about pricing at the point of time that the product or service is being introduced, or even prior to it being introduced to the market, be aware of the fact that as market conditions change and as competitive um, as competitor actions become more apparent, that you will have to consider the different phases from launch to management of the product in the market to product obsolescence or service obsolescence, and giving some thought to that. And it usually follows a typical normal curve distribution or Gaussian distribution. but having that life cycle mindset, even at the outset, is useful.
No, that's a good point, and I think we're touching on something adjacent to that later on when it's one of the questions here from the cohort. I'd like to kind of turn to Jay and Guillaume, one of you or both of you. You're both kind of building different products, different paths to market. Tell us from your perspective, from the founder perspective, how are you going about this or went about this in pricing your product? Did you kind of methodically go through all of these different options? Did you kind of test it out, or was it more of a trial and error, more decision? Just kind of talk through how you're approaching this.
Shall I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I think about it from the very start. It's just the pricing is just at the intersection of the technology, the product, the sales, the marketing, the everything. You just it's not a problem not to know, but it would be a colossal error not to think about it. And thinking is very important, and this is, in my experience, an iterative process. There may be different answers. At the end of the day, you will have to make a choice. But what is most important at the start is to ask questions. Ask questions to experts. Ask questions to your customers, just like Jay said, very important. Ask questions about the value, of course. Ask questions also about the right metrics for the customers. And maybe I can share my experience at UKRS. So what we are doing very briefly is that we are offering the biomanufacturing industry an artificial enzyme which drastically boosts their production yields for any biologics. So my let's say recommendations would be first to be very clear about your own priorities. In the case of Eucharis, it's not the case for all companies. In our case, the number of molecules on which it can be applied is just huge, 20,000. So our priority is just to become a standard in the whole biomanufacturing industry and to generate recurring revenue very fast. And that's our priority. Our priority is not to try to get the maximum amount of money on one molecule. We want to make many molecules. Then second thing which was very important is to align on the customer's KPI. So it's all about understanding the right metrics for them. And for what we are doing, we are selling a production yields booster. So the right metrics is just the volumes of production. So then you have to understand what it costs your customers to produce 1 liter, to produce 5 liter, 2,000 liters. And you can assess that just by asking questions. I was not in that sector before, so just learn, and to learn you need to ask. And at the end of the day, and this is my third recommendation, if you want to sell, you need to make things simple. If you think about all what your customers need to understand in only 1 hour with you, he needs to understand your technology, which is for sure very complex. He needs to understand your product or your service. He needs to understand the value that it will bring to his activity. And even if it's obvious, it's not obvious for everyone. So the guy in front of you has a lot of things to understand. the pricing must be very, very, very simple. And this is the reason why we have adopted subscription fee formula, which is not depending on the molecule. So there will be molecules on which we could have priced higher, okay, but our goal is just to sell very fast on a large amount of molecules.
Yeah, so very dependent on your goal. I think that's a great point. And Brian, did you want to add something on this?
Well, I just want to say I agree, it is a little goal dependent and so forth, but there's a key point there that I think is probably applicable for almost everyone, and that is simplicity is key. Obviously, you're going to spend more time thinking about pricing than your customers, and you want you to spend more time thinking about pricing than your customers. And you really don't want customers trying to optimize, nickel dime, figure out the best way. If you give them a complex pricing schedule, some customers are at least many, and certainly anybody who's going to spend a material amount of money with you, which are the ones you care about the most, are going to spend time thinking about that, optimizing that, and so forth. And you want them excited about the technology and excited about your product and excited about your offering and where it can go in the future. You don't want them thinking about pricing. So you want to make that pricing conversation fast, easy, painless, and simple. So we can talk about negotiation strategies a little bit more later, I think. But the general theme with what Guillaume said around keeping it easy and keeping it simple for people, it doesn't just, and I got to get right, but simplicity will really help to minimize the amount of time and effort that you have to spend and also that your customer has to spend talking about pricing, which is never going to be a pleasant conversation. And so that's one you want to have as fast as possible and get it done. And so I think that key is that aspect is probably true for 29 out of the 30 cohort companies, and I would be surprised if it's not 31 out of 30.
And maybe since you've already kind of touched on this, what are other key considerations that you would advise companies to think about at this stage when they're starting to strategize around what their pricing would look like, what kind of pricing strategy they're choosing, what kind of data they're looking to get in order to set their pricing? What are kind of key factors that they need to take into consideration?
So I think I assume that was to me, Ayelet.
Yes.
Okay. So I guess I think that Edward hit on one of them, a key one, which is the model, right? And how do you want to do it is to say, how much do you want to think about a license versus a consumable cost versus upfront and so forth, structurally and so forth, because it does matter, and there's different customer responsiveness to those different areas. So what is the right model? As an example, I think, and customers, it's not just how much you pay, but it's how you're structuring it and how you're framing it. I find, for example, that a lot of customers don't like licensing. They don't mind paying for consumables, and they'll pay the appropriate price for a product that's delivering value, assuming they're excited about it. But the same way that I would rather buy a product from Amazon that costs $30 as opposed to buy it from somebody else who it costs me $25 and I pay $5 in shipping. I don't like to pay that $5 in shipping. That $5 doesn't feel good to me. I don't feel like it's going into the product. It's kind of wasted, if you will. And the licensing is a little bit the same way. I feel like there's a bit of a disdain. So in some sense, I'd rather pay $10 for a consumable than $5 for a license and $5 for the consumable. As a customer, I find that, for the same $10. Obviously you can't always do that with cell lines and other technologies, but when you can. So I think the business model part is a key important consideration. Competitive benchmarking, never so easy to get. Sometimes you can find list prices online and through other areas. Sometimes you can't. Getting market prices is that much harder, but putting active efforts now and in the future around the competitive benchmarking, at least for your key competitors that you're really thinking about, the industry standard players, is key data that you're going to want to. You're not going to get perfect data, but a data that's kind of directional or a range or an estimate and so forth, and just being able to get clarity around that and having that and then continuing to keep yourself refreshed there is going to be critical to trying to do that, as opposed to just throwing your hands up and saying, I don't know, we're not going to worry about it. So I think that's a second consideration. Ultimately, your costs are important, but as Edward said earlier, costs and cost is really just a back check, and cost plus pricing is invariably the wrong answer. So just take that off the table, but you still would understand. You want to understand if you're losing costs on the marginal side. It might make sense to have a loss leader in some
Of
cases,
course.
but you want to be
Yeah.
sensitive to that. And then the last piece is where you start to quantify this a little bit more. I think there was some discussion earlier about asking customers if they're willing to, what they're willing to pay and so forth. In my experience, direct surveys and so forth around talking with customers gives you somewhere between useless data and damaging data, because people don't, not only do they might not tell you, they actually don't really know what they'd be willing to pay. And people have a really tough time. Think about in your consumer world, what you say, well, what would I be willing to pay for this, this soda or this hamburger or whatever else, and then look at what you actually do pay. And they don't really correlate very well at all at what you're willing to pay. So I think there are survey techniques, conjoint analysis and so forth, that are a little more complex to be able to get some of this data, which is, I think, really critical as you get a little further along and we talk about, specific features and what's most important, et cetera. But ultimately, I just want to, but you've got to use a little more of a sophisticated method as you're collecting this data than a direct question, either whether it's face to face or whether it's, or in a written survey.
That's a perfect segue to let's talk about how you get this data. So, you maybe alluded to it a little bit when you said there's not really a perfect way to get this. And Guillaume, I think you have talked a little bit about talking to your customers, right? Which is a really basic concept here. To others on this panel, anyone that wants to take this question, what are kind of good ways to get that information, and particularly when we're thinking about competitive pricing, without really showing too much of your cards, right? Without tipping off your competitors. What are some good ways to get this data? Who wants to take this? Maybe Edward, if you want to start.
So the question is how to get information about competitor prices, or to get information about buying behavior, that sort of thing. So
Yes, yes. And I guess that could be, that could be either for a specific achieved price, right? What is really the achieved price that people are paying for this, or for other kind of strategies that your competitors are using, what kind of discounts they're giving, just
yeah,
kind of the different data points that you're trying to get to build your price correctly.
yeah. So there are, obviously this will be an estimate at best when you are trying to uncover this type of information. But there are certain things that marketing departments have been doing for many years, and sales management too. So part of it is having some discipline about win-loss, and measuring when it is that you lose business after your initial budgetary quote is given to the customer. So if you, I mean, it's kind of a rule of thumb in pricing. You never really know when you've got the right price, but you certainly do know when you've got the wrong price, because it hits you in the face. Um, then you can also look at purchasing data, your own company's purchasing data, and sometimes you might be able to get aggregated data from other sources like Nielsen reports and Gartner reports on industry-specific purchasing. Then there are kind of a little less conventional, but you've probably heard of this. If you haven't, I'll tell you. It's the idea of the mystery shopper. So where teams actually telephone a competitor and try to place an order, and then you ask about, volume-based discounts and other things like that. You get some idea of what are the prices that are being charged, at least. And then there's obviously publications about list prices and you can make some inferences from there. So it is really trying to triangulate a lot of different data sources. But I would say that win-loss analysis is important, understanding trends in purchasing behavior, uh, talking to people at trade shows, talking to customers, particularly if a competitor is being very successful with a particular pricing model versus the one that you were thinking about, and exploring that a little bit more. So I think one of the other panelists said quite rightly that you learn a lot from asking questions, sitting down with your customers, understanding what their pain points are, and even having a conversation about pricing. And if you get some sense that they feel that the pricing levels in the market are way too high, in relation to the value that they are receiving, that's an important data point. The
So you get a good idea when
Yeah.
talking to them if feel like they're paying way too much, or they feel like they're kind of in the right zone, and where you can fit in.
Yeah, I mean, it was my experience working for GE Healthcare in Sweden at the time that we launched the affinity chromatography resins, the protein A. A lot of people were concerned about the fact that it was costly to manufacture, and therefore it would be costly costly for the customer too. We thought that it would be something that only a few people in the market would adopt. But you learn from experience and talking to customers that this actually turned out to be, from a process economic perspective, a much better way of performing your capture step in downstream processing.
That's great. And I want to switch gears again to, let's say you kind of go through the steps and you build your pricing strategy around your product. But things are not always kind of straightforward, and particularly with Biotool startups, they often sell to different customer types, to academia, biotech, pharmas, CROs, even clinical labs. How should founders, or how do founders really think about pricing across different segments? And maybe we'll start with you, Jay, how you're thinking about this, and maybe one of our other panelists can kind of take a stab as well, and how startups should be thinking about pricing for different segments.
Yeah. And I think I might try to also loop in one of the questions I saw pop up about early access programs, because that's almost a type of
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. As an example, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because you could think of it as like large pharma or
Right.
academics, but you could also
Right.
think of it as early adopters versus, early majority, late majority, like crossing the chasm type of terminology. And to start with the early adopter thing and early access programs in particular, and to reiterate a point about, it's definitely all correlated to your goals, right? If your goal is to go really deep with one customer, that looks different than if your goal is to achieve high market share and repeatable pricing, repeatable transactions in high volume. We are more on that high volume side, and therefore simplicity, enabling a model that is, work at scale, but maybe doesn't work at subscale, and therefore is attractive for people to move quickly on, is a consideration. But we also had an early access program, early adopters, and wrestled with this concept of how do you price for the first people. And of course, they're adding a lot of value to you. But I do think that this is similar to that comment I made at the beginning of, the uncomfortable part is that there's a reason they're early adopters. And it's because they see more value than everybody else in your product. That's why they're interested. And you should be able to charge for that. And just because they're early, you shouldn't overly discount. You could even argue that some of the early adopters are going to be your most perfect customers, and therefore the ones that you can maybe charge the most. I'm not suggesting that, but what I'm getting at is More so than offering huge discounts to early adopters, it can be useful to have more like risk-based pricing or give them more, you don't get to full pricing until you've achieved certain milestones. And that will give you a lot of information about what you can project in the long term and what you can have in general. So that's for the early adopter group. In terms of other types of segmenting, we think about it purely from like academic, biotech, and large pharma. And again, it's goals for us. For us, the goals is how many INDs can we attach to? And for academics, we have much lower pricing than for biotechs, and biotechs lower than large pharma. So at the same time, there needs to be a rational part of this where, it's got to have some sort of continuity between segments. I think it's hard to have totally different pricing, but I think I could also admit that at this point we're still figuring out the right way to do that. I think we've seen companies like Benchling be very successful with preferential pricing for academics to get adoption at that level and or in that segment, and that trickles into the biotech community. I think that makes a lot of sense. How to differentiate between large pharma and biotech is a little bit trickier. It depends on the product. If you have seats, maybe it's easier because there are obviously more people in large pharma, but if it's not seat-based, then it gets a little more complicated.
Brian, maybe you want to comment on this as well. Would you recommend having different pricings for different segments, or would you use other mechanisms to set the price?
So generally speaking, I would say it depends on your ability to discriminate prices and discriminate, right? When we talk about price discrimination, it's not like, sex and racial and so forth, right? It's how much can I effectively put customers or potential customers into these buckets and then, provide price discrimination. And there's different levels of price discrimination, right? You have kind of first degree price discrimination, which is academic versus industrial, or, go to the movies and you got the, child and the adult, or matinee and so forth, right? And then you have more of second degree price discrimination where I can actually make it more tailored to you. So how well can you do it? If you're putting it on the website and so forth and you're providing visibility, it becomes a little more difficult. If everything is a one-off kind of custom license or nuance thing, then you have a lot more ability to do that. So I think it really depends. But broadly speaking, I think about it and I try to focus my price kind of discrimination and my segmentation and so forth, not necessarily by demographics, not by academic versus industrial, but more by application and use, because I think that's going to correlate a lot more to the value that they're generating. We talked earlier about, value-based pricing. So thinking about your primary segment. Now, if there's a way that you can somehow look at secondary applications with maybe have a different price point, I think there's certainly, if you have the ability to price discriminate, that works pretty well. I think
So
the one
almost
caveat,
almost different products in a
almost
way.
different products
Yeah.
or different ways. You're right. You could change the product a little bit, or we could also launch it later with our, kind of you can think about tiering that based on time. As well. The one thing I will tell you is, and this is probably a consideration more for the future for some of you than initially, but I will touch on it briefly. Completely makes sense to have different price points for different countries. There is an operating norm and an expectation, and the cost of doing business and so forth is different in Germany versus Norway versus Singapore versus the US, et cetera, et cetera. And I would definitely think about different pricing, and it's not just currency. Everybody can do the currency adjustment, but actually the competitive benchmarks, the operating norms, the cost of doing business, not just transit and so forth, but everything is going to look a lot different in different countries. So don't just assume that the world is, the science is the same wherever you go. The pricing is not the same.
I'm glad you touched on it. This was one of my backup questions of if we get to it, but I'm glad you commented on it because I think it's important. Let's maybe talk about, we kind of talked about pricing in this market. There's a list price, and there are certain discounts built in for different scenarios. A lot of time these are not visible to other customers, right? It's mostly confidential. Uh, Edward, maybe you could talk about how important is this idea of price uniformity, right? This concept of having a list price and discounting from that versus building different tiers, different price points for different types of product.
Just on that thing about the list price, so sometimes you may see if you do some pricing analysis about what were the actual invoice prices versus your list price, there may be a huge difference between, let's say, the list price is $100 and the achieved
Actually, let
price.
me ask Joe to skip to the next slide. You can actually show an example. I don't know if you want to, but you can either just speak to it or use this. Use this.
Okay. This is a standard waterfall that shows from a list price um, set at $250, the column on the left, and all of the different steps down to the invoice price, and then finally the pocket price. And sometimes these different elements are not understood, and they're either not understood or they're difficult to measure or they can't be measured. I think it's important to break it down in this way so that you understand. So, for example, to your question, let's say it was much simpler than is portrayed in this particular graphic. Let's say it was just a one step down from list price to invoice price, and it was just via a standard discount. If that standard discount was 50%, then your list price is in effect meaningless because it's not it's not representative, or it doesn't really correlate to the invoice price in a logical way. It should be. So then that happens a lot, and so that means that you may need to redo your list prices. But the I guess the overall point of the slide is that there are, if you can measure it, you can manage it, and if you can measure the amount of competitive discount, the cash discount, the fact that the customer will pay net 30 days versus net 90 days on the discount terms, if you can understand that it's more expensive to send your 1 liter of consumable from Germany to the west coast of the US than it is from Germany to Belgium, then the freight costs will be different, and they should be measured and somehow taken into account as part of a negotiation lever. So yes, the more information you have, the more you can deal with it. I just wanted to say one thing because it was a question that had come up, and it was about moving from RUO to GMP.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good question about how, let's say you start off with a Biotools product, which is for research use only, and then at some point you have a GMP grade product that is also going to be sold. It's the same product, at least it seems as if it's the same product, but in fact it is very different. And what that then informs is the need to understand what are the value levers and to quantify those levers. So, for example, the cost of quality management, the cost of batch traceability, the cost of validation, the cost of regulatory compliance, all of these things should go into the pricing structure for the product, and therefore it's differentiated from a research use only to a GMP, and it could be 10x or 50x the price point, and that is a way of positioning not price discrimination, but price positioning one product that is used for research use and another which is used by a biopharmaceutical manufacturer for GMP use on the basis of all the additional investments that are required to deliver a product that has that value, which can be articulated in terms of regulatory compliance, security of supply chain, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. And there are a couple of things you touched on that I would want to go back to maybe in the Q&A part. I want to make sure we focus back on early stage companies and thinking about when a lot of companies in this cohort, in this early stage, are trying to set kind of their pricing strategy without a lot of context, right? So on one hand, they don't have necessarily a lot of significant customer traction to communicate the right value for value-based pricing, for example. And on the other, they don't have a lot of benchmarks because some of these technologies don't have a direct comparison or competitor in the market. How do you kind of navigate that in an early stage startup in these situations, and what is kind of the best way to approach this?
Is that to me, Ayelet?
Either of you. Either of you can take it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I can go, and then Brian or Jay or Guillaume can add. I think it was something that Guillaume said. He has a strategy in mind to try and address these 20,000 molecules that have the right product market fit. And that makes perfect sense to me. But at the same time, you've got to start somewhere, right? You need to find that first buying customer. And the question, and I think either Brian said it last year or the year before, but it's a thought process regarding, do you want to have deeper penetration into the market, or do you want to just skim from the high
Right.
value early adopters? And that question or that choice about going for skimming versus penetration is highly related to whether you want to build a larger customer base, or whether you want to create some value with a smaller number of customers and then go from there. So it's part of the thought process too. But anyway, I will pass it to Brian and others, because I think that they have some insights as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, early on, you're going to be particularly engaged with your customers. And, none of the companies in the cohort are at the point of really scaling, I don't believe, businesses. We're still, earlier in that journey, earlier in that, development, product, making sure we have product market fit, and developing commercial traction. So, yes, lots of considerations around scaling businesses and so forth. I will say you put out there your list, your pricing, and what you put out there around list price does communicate some expectations for sure. But one thing I would probably disagree with from an earlier comment is that if your actual transactional price is substantially below your list price, that might not be a problem. You certainly need to be aware of the explicit discounts and the implicit discounts, but I definitely don't think that's necessarily a problem as long as you're kind of strategic, and it does give you flexibility to adjust and to optimize price as you kind of actually really figure out what the right answer is. Not to mention in the future when you're gonna go to distributors who are gonna say, "Well, I always want a 40% discount," and then you have that room to do that. The I'm just going to add one more final point on this discount part, because I mentioned that word.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I think everybody is probably, if they're doing this, they're doing something wrong, is when they give customers a 10% discount or a 20% discount or a 50% discount. It's fine to give a promotion to say, "Hey, we're going to run this promotion, and we're going to say, hey, look, if you do this, this month, this quarter, whatever, we're going to give you 10% off, 20% off, or whatever." But if you're actually negotiating with a customer, your discount percentages should never be whole round numbers, because it makes it look like you have lots more room to go, or at least some more room to go. So I strongly recommend the discount of 12.7% as opposed to 10 or 15. And just a little, just a little something. Obviously, 12.7 is a little arbitrary. I understand that, and it could be 8.9, and it could be 16.2. You choose the number. I don't really care, but don't make it 20.
All right, that's memorable advice. And while we're at it, since we're almost at the hour, time flies. We will maybe we'll have each one of you kind of give us either their best advice for startups in the room here that are listening, and best advice in setting their pricing strategy, or a common mistake that they should really avoid. Jay, let's go to you.
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I would say it's mainly talk about pricing very early, set higher numbers in those conversations, see how people react. There's a lot of learning in that. When you say a number and people say no way, it's a great time to say what would you need to see for that to be worthwhile? Because that is the key question, right? Whenever you're doing customer discovery, that's when it all comes together. And I've been a subject to a survey. I've implemented a survey where questions are always like, would this be useful for you? And that is just, will lead you astray compared to, would you pay $1 million for this? And if not, why not?
All right, Guillaume.
I would have 4 points. The very first one would be that you do not need to be afraid to start. You need to start. There are many customers outside. If you lose one, this is not a huge problem. Or if you have not so many customers, you have another problem. The first thing is that you need to go outside to ask for advices, and this is a great opportunity. The Biotools Innovator Program, since you will have access to incredible mentors, and one of mine is in the room, so I can say that to him. Third point, and this is, I think, a great advice I could give you, which is to wait the most you can before giving a number to your customers. Ask many, many, many questions, because if you shoot a number, first of all, the only thing you know with that number is that you will never be able to say higher than this number. And first of all, if it's really disconnected from the reality of the customer, you will just lose the customer for silly reasons. So wait the most you can before putting a number on the table, and ask many, many questions before that to just not make a mistake. And again, it's not a real problem to make a mistake, but if you can avoid it, it's better. And the last thing is an advice I can give you. As soon as you have one customer, do not hesitate to use this customer as an example to others. It's fantastically efficient in my experience to say to one customer, hey, there is the one guy outside of that, just the same job, just the same activity. He's paid that. Why cannot you pay that?
All right, that's great. Great advice. And then Edward, do you want to wrap this up for us?
Sure. So I would say that we discussed it a bit, but the the idea of cost plus pricing is not a bad idea to start with, because at least you, as I said, it's simple, it's intuitive, and it ensures that um, your product is being sold at a profit, which is basically a requirement for business. However, it doesn't take into account competitors, and it doesn't take into account customer value. So it's very much more important to consider the value that is perceived by the customer, because on that basis you can set the right price, or at least get towards setting the right price, which is the objective of this webinar. The other thing I think that I would say is that learn to enjoy it too, because it can be, the more you get into it, the more you can understand, hey, we are charging the same price to this customer here, but for some reason it seems to be more of a drain on our resources than customer A versus customer B. So not all customers are the same, and some customers can be more profitable than others. So be aware of that. And I suppose the third thing is that, and it was something that Guillaume said, like looking outside of the industry. Also, you've got to look outside your own company, because your costs within your own company are going to be very different to the costs at another company that might be a similar type of company to you, but they could be based in a completely different part of the world and have completely different cost drivers. So be aware of the fact that it's not just a different industry, but it's also, look outside your own four walls and try to understand the market that you're operating in. So those are the three things really. Values better than value-based pricing, better than cost-based pricing, but don't throw cost plus
Out the
pricing
window.
out of the
Yeah.
window. It's a good starting point. And learn to enjoy it and have fun.
All right. Well, thank you. We're at the hour, a little bit after the hour, so we will, at this point, bid our online viewers